By Christmas Eve of 1895, the limestone walls above the French Broad River in Asheville, North Carolina, were already catching the last light of the year. Inside Biltmore House, George Washington Vanderbilt's self-described Little Mountain Escape, a 175,000 square foot French Renaissance chateau designed by Richard Morris Hunt, stood finished at last after 6 years of construction and more than 1,000 workers on site. In the grand staircase, a 1,700-pound iron chandelier hung 4 stories down from a single bolt in the roof, its new electric bulbs glowing against sculpted stone and carved balustrades. A society visitor had written in the guest book that Vanderbilt's home was a true American castle. The air smelled of fir branches and coal smoke. Somewhere below, 25 tons of coal would burn in 2 winter weeks just to keep the house warm. The chandelier's light said permanence, but the ledger books on a nearby desk already said something else. Tonight, the house was at its brightest. It would never be this secure again. In the mid-1880s, a young George Washington Vanderbilt traveled with his mother, Maria Louisa Kissam Vanderbilt, to the Asheville area at the height of the Gilded Age. He was the bookish youngest son of a railroad dynasty, uninterested in running the family's vast shipping and rail empire, but fascinated by art, architecture, and the possibilities of land. Born in 1862 on Staten Island, he had grown up surrounded by wealth so immense that ordinary calculations of expense and return had little meaning. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had built one of the largest fortunes in American history through shipping and railroads, dying in 1877 with an estate valued at over $100 million. His father, William Henry Vanderbilt, had doubled that fortune through shrewd management of the railroad holdings, becoming for a time the richest man in America. George's inheritance would be substantial, but as the youngest of 8 children, he would receive less than his older brothers, perhaps $10 million, rather than the $50 million that went to the eldest sons. The distinction mattered less than it might seem. $10 million in 1885 represented wealth beyond the comprehension of ordinary Americans, a sum that could finance almost any project a young man might conceive. George had no need to work, no obligation to manage the family enterprises, no expectations beyond those he set for himself. His brothers had already claimed the obvious paths. Cornelius II was building the Breakers in Newport, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that would cost more than $7 million. William Kay was constructing Marble House, a temple to classical architecture that would become one of the most photographed buildings in America. Frederick was assembling an estate on Long Island. The competition among the brothers was fierce, conducted in limestone and marble, measured in square footage and imported furnishings. George had different ambitions. Where his brothers sought to dominate the social landscapes of Newport and New York, he looked to the mountains of the South, to a region that Gilded Age society largely ignored. The Blue Ridge Mountains spread before him in hues of violet and gray, their ancient ridges softened by morning mist, and something in that landscape called to him in ways that Fifth Avenue never had. The mountains were older than the Appalachians, older than most ranges on Earth, their peaks worn down by hundreds of millions of years of weather and erosion. They possessed a permanence that no human construction could match, yet they were also wounded, their forests stripped by logging, their soils exhausted by decades of careless farming. He noted the climate and the elevation, the mild summers that offered relief from northern heat, and the possibilities for cultivation that others had overlooked. Asheville had become a modest resort town, drawing visitors who sought relief from tuberculosis and other respiratory ailments in the clear mountain air. Doctors prescribed the climate as therapy, and sanitariums dotted the surrounding hillsides. But George saw possibilities beyond the health trade. The region's poverty, which had deepened since the Civil War, meant that land was cheap and labor was plentiful. A man with sufficient vision and sufficient capital might create something altogether different from the urban palaces his family favored. He began buying land on the hills south of Asheville, parcel by parcel, farm by farm, working through agents who often concealed the identity of the true purchaser to avoid inflating prices. The transactions were recorded in Buncombe County courthouses, each deed adding another piece to a puzzle that only George could see complete. Worn-out tobacco fields passed into his hands, their soils exhausted by decades of single-crop agriculture that had stripped the nutrients from the red clay. Overgrazed pastures came next, hillsides scarred by erosion where trees had been cut for timber or fuel. Small farmhouses with their outbuildings, the modest holdings that generations of Appalachian families had worked to create, dissolved one by one into a single expanding vision. The families who sold were neither coerced nor cheated. The prices George paid were fair by local standards, often generous. But the scale of acquisition transformed the social landscape as surely as he would later transform the physical one. Where dozens of independent farmers had worked their own land, there would soon be a single owner and hundreds of employees. The change was neither simple improvement nor simple displacement, but something more complex, a transition from one way of organizing land and labor to another entirely different system, one that promised greater efficiency and productivity while eliminating the independence that small farmers had valued above almost everything else. Eventually, he assembled 125,000 acres, a tract larger than many American cities, larger than some eastern states' counties, which he named Biltmore. The name combined de Bilt, his Dutch ancestral seat near Utrecht in the Netherlands, with more, an Old English term for open rolling land. The hybrid etymology captured something of his ambition, to create a European-style estate on American soil, a working agricultural domain that would be both productive and beautiful, that would rehabilitate a damaged landscape while providing employment to hundreds and eventually thousands of workers. The vision was aristocratic in its assumptions, yet progressive in its methods, drawing on the latest scientific thinking about forestry and agriculture while recreating social relationships that had largely disappeared from the American landscape. By around 1888, George spoke of building only a little mountain escape, a phrase that would be remembered with considerable irony in later years. What he meant by escape was altogether different from what ordinary language might suggest. His mountain retreat would require 6 years of construction, more than 1,000 workers at peak employment, and expenditures that would strain even Vanderbilt resources. The phrase itself appears in contemporary correspondence, and was later repeated in articles and tour narratives, always with that same mixture of wonder and slight mockery at the gap between the modest language and the immodest reality. He commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design the house. Hunt was then America's most celebrated architect, the first American admitted to the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, designer of Fifth Avenue mansions and cultural institutions, and most recently responsible for the pedestal that elevated the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. Born in 1827 in Brattleboro, Vermont, Hunt had studied in Europe for 9 years, absorbing the traditions of French architecture that would shape his mature practice. He returned to America in 1855 and quickly established himself as the architect of choice for the wealthiest families in the nation. Hunt understood how to build for the wealthy. He had spent his career creating settings for American fortunes to display themselves. His clients included the Astors and the Belmonts, families whose names defined social prominence in Gilded Age America. But George's commission presented challenges unlike any he had faced before. The site was remote, accessible only by rail and then by rough mountain roads. The scale was unprecedented, larger than anything Hunt had attempted even for his wealthiest previous clients. The vision combined European chateau architecture with American technological innovation in ways that would require constant creative problem-solving. Most importantly, George wanted not merely a summer house but a complete estate, a functioning agricultural enterprise wrapped in architectural splendor. Alongside Hunt came Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who had designed Central Park and whose reputation as the father of American landscape architecture was already secure. Olmsted was born in 1822 in Hartford, Connecticut, and had come to landscape architecture through an unusual path that included farming, publishing, and journalism. His design for Central Park, created with his partner Calvert Vaux in 1858, had established new principles for public space in American cities. His subsequent work on parks in Brooklyn, Boston, Chicago, and dozens of other cities had confirmed his standing as the preeminent landscape designer in the nation. Olmsted was nearing the end of his career when George approached him, his health declining and his energy limited. He suffered from what was then called nervous exhaustion, a condition that would today probably be diagnosed as depression or anxiety, and he had periodic episodes that left him unable to work. But the Biltmore Commission captured his imagination precisely because it offered something beyond mere garden design. George wanted to transform a damaged landscape, to rehabilitate worn-out farmland through scientific forestry and careful management. The project aligned perfectly with Olmsted's conservation beliefs, his conviction that land could be both beautiful and productive if managed according to rational principles rather than exploited for short-term gain. Olmsted's reports from his early visits described exhausted soils and eroded hillsides, a landscape that required not merely arrangement but rehabilitation. The years of tobacco cultivation and uncontrolled logging had stripped the land of its natural fertility. Gullies cut through hillsides where topsoil had washed away. Streams ran muddy after every rain, carrying more soil toward the French Broad River and eventually the sea. The forests that remained were scrubby second growth, nothing like the magnificent virgin timber that had covered these mountains before European settlement. Olmsted saw the damage clearly and believed it could be healed, but he also understood that healing would require decades of patient work. He proposed a systematic program of replanting, beginning with fast-growing species that could stabilize slopes and restore fertility before more valuable trees were introduced. White pines would anchor the eroding hillsides. Native hardwoods would follow as the soil recovered its structure and nutrients. The work would take generations to complete, Olmsted warned George, but it would create something unprecedented in America: a private forest managed according to scientific principles, productive and beautiful at once. This vision would eventually lead to the establishment of the first forestry school in America and would influence conservation policy for decades to come. The architectural correspondence from Hunt's office in New York reveals a project growing beyond all initial conceptions. Preliminary Beaux-Arts floor plans and elevations showed a French Renaissance chateau of ever-expanding ambition. Each revision added another wing, another tower, another flourish of carved limestone. The models that Hunt's draftsmen built were photographed for approval, three-dimensional representations of dreams still taking shape. The style drew from Loire Valley chateaux like Blois and Chambord, royal residences that had sheltered French kings, adapted now for an American railroad heir who wanted something that even his wealthier brothers had not achieved. The design evolved through constant communication between New York and North Carolina. Hunt would propose, George would respond with requests for modifications, Hunt would revise and propose again. The staircase grew grander. The entrance hall expanded. The library required more shelving for George's growing collection of rare books. Each change added to the cost and complexity, but George seemed untroubled by expense. The house would be what it needed to be, and the resources would follow. In Hunt's New York studio, light fell across drafting tables covered with tracing paper, and the scratch of pen on heavy stock traced the first outline of what would become the grand staircase. The chandelier that would one day hang there was still only a circle of ink, a placeholder for magnificence yet to be forged. Plans showed the relationship between public and private spaces, between the grand reception rooms where guests would gather and the service areas where servants would work largely unseen. The house would contain both medieval grandeur and modern convenience, its stone walls hiding steel framing, its carved fireplaces supplemented by central heating, its candlelit appearances supported by electrical systems that Edison himself would help design. Mist gathered over the Blue Ridge in early mornings while survey flags marked the ground where foundations would be dug, where limestone would rise against the ancient hills. The land itself was being transformed even before construction began, as Olmsted's crews planted trees and graded roads and began the slow work of soil restoration. The decision to carve a palace out of a wounded landscape was framed even then as both philanthropic experiment and act of tremendous ego. George spoke of healing the hills, of providing employment, of demonstrating that conservation and production could coexist. Critics would later see only the stamp of a single name across a landscape that had belonged to hundreds of families, the erasure of one way of life to create another. But even in these early conceptual stages, the seeds of future difficulty were being planted alongside the garden plans. A self-described escape vast enough to swallow an ordinary fortune, a vision so grand that its operating costs would eventually exceed the income of all but the wealthiest individuals in the nation, was taking shape on paper before a single stone was laid. The question that no one asked, perhaps because no one wished to hear the answer, was what would happen when the fortune that built it could no longer sustain what had been built. Before a single stone was laid, Biltmore's future weakness was already present in its scale, embedded in the very ambition that made it magnificent. In 1889, more than 1,000 workers began construction on the site above the French Broad River. The scale of the operation transformed Asheville from a small mountain resort into a boomtown of laborers and craftsmen, its population swelling with men drawn from across the region and beyond by the promise of steady wages, hotels filled with supervisors and specialized craftsmen, boarding houses open to accommodate the laborers who could not find rooms elsewhere. Merchants expanded their stocks to meet the demand for tools, materials, and provisions. The economic impact rippled outward from the construction site, touching every aspect of life in the small mountain community. Trains hauled Indiana limestone into the station along newly laid tracks, the great pale blocks arriving by the carload from quarries near Bedford, hundreds of miles north. The limestone was prized for its uniformity and workability, its ability to take carved detail without crumbling, its soft cream color that would weather gracefully over decades. Each block was cut roughly to size at the quarry, then finished on site by teams of skilled stonecutters who shaped the stone to Hunt's exacting specifications. The railway cars arrived in a continuous stream, their loads offloaded by cranes and sorted into staging areas where the blocks awaited their turn to be lifted into place. The infrastructure required to support construction was itself a major undertaking. A private railway spur connected the main line to the construction site, allowing materials to be delivered directly to where they were needed. A brick kiln produced the millions of bricks required for interior walls and foundations. A woodworking shop turned out the frames and forms needed for the stonework. Blacksmiths forged the iron hardware and tools that the other workers required. The site operated as a self-contained industrial operation, a factory dedicated to producing a single product of unprecedented scale and complexity. Cranes raised the limestone blocks into place on the east-facing facade, which stretched 375 feet wide, longer than a football field, modeled on Loire Valley Chateau, but executed on a scale that exceeded even those royal residences. The sound of hammers against chisels rang through the mountain air from dawn until dusk, and dust floated in bands of afternoon light through the open arches of unfinished windows. Teams of stonecutters worked in organized sequences, each man responsible for a specific type of cut or finish, their skills honed through years of training and traditions that stretched back to medieval cathedral builders. Richard Morris Hunt's design called for over 250 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space. The numbers stagger comprehension: 35 bedrooms for family and guests, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a gymnasium. The basement alone covered an acre, housing the mechanical systems that would power and heat the building. Steel framing hidden behind the limestone walls represented the latest in structural engineering, a skeleton of modernity clothed in medieval stone. This was not a house built in the traditional manner, with load-bearing masonry walls supporting each floor above. Instead, a framework of steel beams and columns carried the weight, allowing Hunt to create spans and openings that traditional construction could never have achieved. 16 chimneys rose above slate roofs of blue-gray, their profiles visible for miles against the mountain backdrop. Each chimney served multiple fireplaces, carrying away the smoke and gases from the 65 hearths distributed throughout the building. The slate itself came from quarries in Vermont, chosen for its durability and color, laid in patterns that would resist water infiltration for generations if properly maintained. The roofing alone covered several acres and required specialized workers who understood the traditional techniques of slate installation, knowledge that was already becoming rare in an age of increasingly industrialized construction. Italian artisans carved trefoils and tracery into the limestone facades, their chisels producing gargoyles and grotesques that stared down from parapets and cornices, with expressions ranging from mischievous to menacing. These craftsmen had been recruited from the workshops of Europe, brought to the North Carolina mountains specifically for this project. They worked from Hunt's drawings, but also exercised their own creativity, adding personal touches to the secondary ornaments that would remain largely invisible from ground level. Their skills represented centuries of accumulated tradition, passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain that connected Biltmore's construction to the great cathedrals of medieval France. The architecture attempted to fuse permanence with progress, to wrap the conveniences of the new age in the aesthetics of the old. Behind the carved stone exterior, pipes carried hot water from basement boilers to cast iron radiators in every room. The heating system was designed by a specialist firm that had equipped the finest hotels and office buildings in New York, adapted for a residential setting of unprecedented scale. Electrical wiring threaded through conduits in the walls, tied to George Vanderbilt's friendship with Thomas Edison, and connected to an early, direct current generating system that made Biltmore one of the most technologically advanced homes in America. The house would have its own electrical plant, powered initially by generators on site and later connected to hydroelectric facilities developed on estate property. The system required its own staff of engineers and electricians, men trained in technology so new that few people in the country understood it. Electric lighting was still a novelty in 1890, found mainly in large cities and wealthy households. That Biltmore would have electricity throughout was a statement of modernity, as emphatic as its medieval styling was a statement of tradition. The house looked backward to the chateau of France while reaching forward to a technological future that most Americans could barely imagine. Inside, the grand staircase rose 4 stories through the heart of the house, its cantilevered limestone treads curving upward in an elegant spiral. Each step projected from the wall without visible support, an engineering feat that combined traditional stone cutting with modern structural calculation. The mathematics required to ensure that each tread would support not only its own weight, but the weight of people walking on it was complex, involving forces and moments that only trained engineers could properly analyze. The multi-level iron chandelier that would become the building's most recognizable feature weighed approximately 1,700 pounds and was suspended from a single bolt in the roof, an achievement that visitors would marvel at for more than a century. The chandelier was designed by Hunt's office and fabricated by a New York firm that specialized in architectural metalwork. It combined hundreds of individual components, iron arms and brackets, glass shades and prisms, copper wiring and porcelain sockets. When lit, its numerous bulbs would cast light down all 4 floors of the stairwell, creating an effect both dramatic and somewhat unsettling. The weight hanging overhead seemed to defy common sense, supported by that single bolt in ways that most observers could not quite understand. The effect was intentional. The chandelier was meant to inspire wonder, to make visitors stop and stare upward, to understand immediately that they had entered a space unlike any they had seen before. The first lighting test of the chandelier sent a blaze of bare bulbs through the unfinished stair hall, throwing shadows of ironwork onto raw plaster walls that would soon be finished in the finest materials available. Workers gathered to watch, shading their eyes against the unprecedented brightness of electrical illumination in a region where kerosene lamps and candles still lit most homes. The effect was theatrical, transformative, a glimpse of the future that this building was designed to embody. In that moment, with the light blazing and the shadows dancing on unfinished walls, the promise of Biltmore seemed limitless. The Guastavino. Tile vaults of the loggia represented another technological marvel. Rafael Guastavino, the Spanish architect who had perfected the technique, supervised their installation personally, traveling from New York to oversee the placement of each interlocking terracotta tile. Born in Valencia in 1842, Guastavino had emigrated to America in 1881, bringing with him a construction method that dated back to medieval Catalonia. The technique used thin tiles laid in overlapping layers with quick-setting morite, creating structures that were self-supporting almost immediately without the elaborate wooden forms that traditional masonry required. The method created arches of remarkable strength and beauty, structures that would resist fire and water and the settling that plagued conventional construction. The tiles, locked together in patterns derived from Mediterranean tradition, their curved surfaces distributing loads in ways that allowed for thinner construction and larger spans than traditional masonry could achieve. Guastavino would go on to design tile vaults for Grand Central Terminal, the Boston Public Library, and hundreds of other prominent buildings. His work at Biltmore was among his finest, the graceful curves of the loggia ceiling demonstrating what the technique could achieve in the hands of a master. The swimming pool in the basement, lined with underwater lighting, was among the first indoor pools in America, a luxury that few hotels could match and no private residence had attempted. The pool was surrounded by dressing rooms and bathing facilities designed for the comfort of guests who might wish to swim at any time of year. The gymnasium offered the latest in exercise equipment, including rowing machines and weight apparatus that reflected contemporary ideas about physical fitness. A bowling alley provided entertainment for guests on rainy days, its polished lanes and mechanical pin setters representing another application of technology to domestic life. These amenities spoke to a vision of domestic life as comprehensive resort, a private world where every need and desire could be satisfied without leaving the property. The guests who would eventually arrive at Biltmore would find not merely a house but a complete environment, designed for their comfort and entertainment in ways that even the great hotels of New York and Europe could not match. Every detail had been considered, from the ventilation systems that kept the air fresh to the speaking tubes that allowed communication between floors without shouting. The house was designed to function as a machine for living, despite its apparent allegiance to medieval tradition. Construction photographs from 1893 show the east elevation rising from scaffolding, the limestone walls climbing higher with each passing month. Interior shots captured the unfinished entrance hall and winter garden, their spaces still raw but already suggesting the grandeur to come. Payroll ledgers listed stonecutters and Italian carvers alongside local laborers, the wages of a small army flowing out from Vanderbilt coffers week after week. The smell of fresh mortar and hot steel filled the site as workers pushed toward the Christmas deadline that George Vanderbilt had set for the house's opening. Richard Morris Hunt worried about deadlines from his New York office, even as his health began to fail. The correspondence reveals an architect increasingly aware of his own mortality, determined to see his greatest work completed before he could no longer supervise its construction. He made trips to the site when his strength allowed, climbing through the unfinished spaces and marking drawings with corrections and refinements. He died in August of 1895, just 4 months before the house opened, having seen his vision realized in stone, but not having lived to see it furnished and inhabited. His son, Richard Howland Hunt, would complete the remaining interior details, working from his father's drawings with a fidelity born of grief and professional duty. Frederick Law Olmsted visited the muddy site regularly, already imagining the formal gardens and conservatory that would complement the architecture. His plans called for lagoons and terraces, for an Italian garden with pools and sculpture, for a walled rose garden and a shrub garden and an azalea garden, for a ramble through naturalized woodland and a deer park stocked with European fallow deer. The vision extended far beyond the immediate surroundings of the house, encompassing thousands of acres that would be transformed from exhausted farmland into productive forest. His health was failing too, his mind beginning to show signs of the dementia that would eventually require his commitment to an asylum, but he pushed on, supervising the work through correspondence and occasional visits. Construction costs reportedly reached approximately $5 million by completion in December 1895, a staggering sum that would translate to well over $150 million in modern currency. The figure was not unprecedented for Vanderbilt construction, but it represented a commitment of resources to a single building in a remote location that even George's wealthy brothers might have questioned. The house was conceived as a technological marvel wrapped in medieval stone, an attempt to fuse progress with timelessness. Yet by the winter of 1895, as the last scaffolding came down and the limestone walls stood complete against the December sky, what no one could yet see were the hidden scaffolds of money and labor that would be needed to keep the lights burning, the furnaces fed, and the vast machinery of domestic service running year after year. On Christmas Eve of 1895, George Washington Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to family and friends for the first time. Guests arrived by private railcar at the Biltmore station, a structure designed in the chateau style to welcome visitors with appropriate grandeur before they had even glimpsed the main house. The station featured covered platforms and comfortable waiting rooms, its architecture establishing the visual language that would characterize the entire estate. From the station, guests traveled by carriage up the 3-mile approach road through the redesigned landscape, past the lodge gate and along winding drives that Olmsted had planned to build anticipation, revealing and concealing views of the chateau until the final dramatic approach across the esplanade. The approach was carefully choreographed to maximize psychological impact. The road wound through forests that Olmsted's crews had planted and tended, past meadows that suggested natural countryside rather than designed landscape. Glimpses of the house appeared and disappeared as the road curved through the terrain, each view more complete than the last. Finally, after a last turn, the full facade came into view across a broad lawn, the limestone walls and blue slate roofs rising against the mountain backdrop in a tableau that seemed to have existed for centuries rather than mere years. What greeted guests upon arrival was a house fully furnished with European art, rare Flemish tapestries, and treasures collected across decades of travel and acquisition. George had been building this collection since his youth, touring European galleries and auction houses with a discerning eye and the resources to act on his judgments. He read extensively about art history and connoisseurship, educating himself to a level that allowed him to deal confidently with dealers and experts. The collection he assembled represented not merely wealth but knowledge, not merely acquisition but taste. The library alone contained more than 10,000 volumes, many of them rare editions that dealers had sought out specifically for his collection. The shelves rose 2 stories high, accessible by a spiral staircase and rolling ladders that allowed retrieval of books from the highest shelves. The collection included incunabula from the earliest years of printing, illuminated manuscripts from medieval monasteries, first editions of literary classics, and comprehensive runs of scholarly journals. George was a genuine bibliophile, a man who read the books he collected rather than treating them merely as decorative objects or financial investments. The walls displayed paintings by Monet and Renoir, by Sargent and Whistler, works that represented the finest achievements of contemporary art, alongside old masters acquired from aristocratic families and church collections. The collection eventually numbered some 92,000 items, including furniture, decorative arts, textiles, and architectural elements salvaged from European buildings. Each piece had been selected for its quality and its suitability for the spaces Hunt had designed, creating interiors that felt coherent rather than merely accumulated. The house was not a museum, but a home, though a home furnished with museum-quality objects. The banquet hall, with its 70-foot barrel-vaulted ceiling and triple fireplace large enough to roast an ox, served as the ceremonial heart of the Christmas celebration. The ceiling rose high above the long table, its surface decorated with painted motifs that recalled medieval great halls. A Skinner pipe organ filled the space with music, its pipes rising behind an ornate screen at one end of the hall, its sounds reverberating off stone walls and vaulted ceiling. The fireplace, the largest in the house, burned 12-foot logs that had to be maneuvered into place by teams of servants using special equipment. The logs were so large that they burned for days, requiring little attention once properly ignited. Above the mantel hung flags and trophies, giving the room the atmosphere of a medieval great hall, updated with every modern convenience. Antlers from hunting expeditions decorated the walls alongside ancestral portraits and historical tapestries. The overall effect was baronial, a deliberate invocation of European aristocratic tradition adapted for an American setting. Guests dining beneath the vaulted ceiling could imagine themselves transported to a different age, participants in rituals that connected them to centuries of tradition, even as they enjoyed the latest in heating, lighting, and kitchen technology. The house required staggering inputs merely to function through a single winter week. 25 tons of coal would burn in 2 weeks during the winter of 1900 just to maintain comfortable temperatures in the principal rooms. The figure seems scarcely believable until one considers the scale of the space being heated. 4 acres of floor area distributed across 250 rooms, many of them featuring ceiling heights of 15 feet or more, all of them losing heat through windows and walls despite the best insulation available. The heating system, for all its sophistication, struggled against the basic physics of maintaining warm air in vast spaces during mountain winters. The coal arrived by train, was stored in basement bunkers, and was shoveled into furnaces by a continuous rotation of firemen who worked around the clock during cold weather. The ashes had to be removed, the furnaces cleaned and maintained, the boilers monitored for pressure and performance. This was industrial-scale heating applied to domestic purposes, requiring the kind of infrastructure and labor force that a factory might employ. The romance of the great fireplaces, blazing in the principal rooms, obscured the grimy reality of the basement operations that made those fires possible. Hundreds of staff worked above and below stairs to keep the establishment running. The hierarchy was complex and formal, modeled on British great houses but adapted for American conditions. A butler supervised the male indoor servants, a housekeeper the female. Footmen served at table and attended to guests' needs. Maids cleaned rooms and changed linens. Laundresses washed mountains of fabric. Kitchen staff prepared meals ranging from family breakfasts to formal banquets for dozens. The servants wore livery appropriate to their positions, their costumes establishing visual hierarchies that guests could read at a glance. Below this, domestic staff worked the estate workers, gardeners and groundskeepers, stable hands and dairy workers, farmers and foresters who maintained the productive operations that were supposed to make Biltmore self-sustaining. The total employment varied seasonally, but often exceeded several hundred people, all of them dependent on Vanderbilt wages and all of them contributing to the smooth operation of the estate. The organizational complexity rivaled that of a small corporation, requiring systems for scheduling, supervision, payment, and discipline that George and his managers had to create largely from scratch. Guest lists from those early years read like a social register of the Gilded Age, and society column reports described Biltmore as a palace worthy of emperors, as an American castle without rival on the continent. The guest book filled with signatures of the prominent and powerful, each expressing wonder at what George Vanderbilt had created in the mountains of western North Carolina. Politicians came, and diplomats, and captains of industry whose fortunes rivaled the Vanderbilt's own. Artists and writers came, drawn by George's reputation as a patron and by curiosity about the house itself. The visitors departed with stories that spread through drawing rooms and clubs from Newport to Manhattan to San Francisco. Morning sun filtered through the glass roof of the winter garden, illuminating tropical plantings and casting patterns on the tile floor while guests took their breakfast nearby. The winter garden was one of Biltmore's most innovative spaces, a conservatory that brought the outdoors inside during months when the mountain climate made actual gardens impossible to enjoy. Palms and ferns grew in beds beneath the glass, surrounding a marble fountain that provided the sound of running water even in January. The temperature was maintained year-round at levels suitable for tropical plants, creating a microclimate that contrasted dramatically with the cold mountain air outside. The chime of centrally controlled clocks announced the hour in coordinated harmony throughout the house, a mechanical symphony of precision timekeeping that seemed to impose order on the natural world outside. The clocks were connected by electrical wiring to a master clock, ensuring that every timepiece in the building showed the same time to the second. This was another expression of the technological mastery that pervaded Biltmore. Even time itself was brought under centralized control, regulated by machinery hidden in the walls. In 1898, George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris, bringing to Biltmore a woman of grace and practical intelligence who would prove essential to the estate's survival in years to come. Edith came from an old American family, not as wealthy as the Vanderbilts, but socially impeccable, descended from Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch Director General of New Amsterdam. She was educated, cultured, and possessed of the organizational skills that managing a household of this scale would require. She spoke several languages and moved easily in European society, characteristics that made her an ideal partner for George's cosmopolitan lifestyle. Their marriage was a genuine partnership, and the letters that survive suggest both affection and mutual respect. Edith was not merely a decorative spouse but an active participant in managing the estate, involved in decisions about staff, operations, and finances. Her practical abilities would prove crucial in the difficult years ahead, when the burden of maintaining Biltmore would fall entirely on her shoulders. In 1900, their daughter Cornelia was born in the Louis XV room at Biltmore, the only child of the union and the heir apparent to a kingdom of stone and forest. Her birth was celebrated with the kind of attention that Vanderbilt events always attracted, noted in society columns from New York to Newport to Paris. But there was also something poignant about a single child born in a house designed to accommodate dozens in a nursery wing that could have served a small school. The estate that George had built for generations of descendants would pass to just one heir, concentrating the burden of preservation on a single pair of shoulders. The camera of memory tilts up the grand staircase in these years to find the chandelier blazing at full brilliance, its light reflected in polished limestone treads as guests in evening dress moved beneath it. For visitors and family alike, it became the visual shorthand for Biltmore's first unquestioned confidence, a symbol of permanence and power that seemed to say the Vanderbilt fortune would sustain this creation forever. For a brief moment, the architecture seemed to have succeeded in freezing time, a private palace suspended above the economic turmoil of the 1890s. The Depression of 1893 had shaken the nation, bankrupting railroads and closing banks and throwing millions out of work. But the Vanderbilt fortune, built on railroads and shipping, seemed proof against any storm. George continued to buy art and books, to expand the gardens, to invest in forestry projects that would not show returns for decades. The confidence was genuine, but perhaps also willful, a refusal to consider that the world in which such houses made sense might itself be changing. Yet even as the last Christmas candles burned low and the new century approached, new laws and new costs were beginning to erode the financial bedrock beneath the stone. The federal income tax, first imposed during the Civil War and then allowed to lapse, was already being debated in Congress again. The progressive era was dawning, bringing with it new ideas about the concentration of wealth and the responsibilities of the wealthy to the broader society. The servants who made possible the operation of such houses were beginning to seek other opportunities in factories and offices where hours were fixed and conditions were better regulated. The certainties that had built Biltmore were less certain than they appeared in the chandelier's steady light. In the early 1900s, Biltmore operated as both family home and high society destination, a place where the Vanderbilts could retreat from the pressures of New York while still maintaining their position in the social firmament. The journey from the Northeast was long but comfortable, private rail cars delivering visitors to a world that seemed separate from ordinary American life. The train journey itself became part of the experience, a gradual transition from the bustle of urban life to the quiet grandeur of the mountain estate. Guests would watch the landscape change through their compartment windows, the flat coastal plains giving way to Piedmont hills and finally to the blue ridges of the southern mountains. Guests included authors Edith Wharton and Henry James, diplomats and politicians, industrial magnates and European nobility, all drawn to the novelty of a European chateau set amid Appalachian hills. The guest list represented the pinnacle of American and international society, the circle that determined taste and set standards for the aspiring classes below. Invitations to Biltmore were prized precisely because they were rare, extended only to those who had achieved the highest levels of social, cultural, or economic distinction. To be invited was to be recognized as belonging to an exclusive world that most Americans could only glimpse from outside. Edith Wharton, who would later write with devastating precision about the Gilded Age society she knew so well, visited and observed. Her novels captured the tensions between old money and new, between appearance and reality, between the houses that families built and the secrets those houses contained. She understood the social machinery that produced establishments like Biltmore, the complex web of obligation and aspiration that governed the lives of the wealthy. Her visits provided material for the fictional estates that would populate her novels, composite creations that drew from Biltmore and dozens of other great houses she had known. Henry James, the master of psychological nuance, found in Biltmore material for his endless meditations on American wealth and European culture, on innocence and experience, on the price that aspiration exacts from those who aspire. James was fascinated by the collision between American energy and European tradition, and Biltmore embodied that collision in architectural form. The house looked like a Loire Valley chateau but ran on American electricity. It affected medieval grandeur but employed the latest industrial technology. These contradictions fed James's imagination, providing examples for the themes he explored throughout his late novels. These were not merely social visits, but encounters between a place and the sensibilities that would eventually interpret it for posterity. The writers who stayed at Biltmore carried away impressions that would shape how later generations understood the Gilded Age. Their published observations and unpublished letters provided evidence of what life in such an establishment actually felt like, how the architecture affected those who lived within it, how the social rituals of the wealthy played out in spaces designed to impress and intimidate. The banquet hall, with its Skinner pipe organ and medieval tapestries, became the symbolic heart of social life at the estate. Dinners staged beneath the chandelier's distant glow on the staircase landing above brought together the powerful and the prominent in settings designed to inspire awe. The scale of the room dwarfed individual guests, reminding them of their place in a larger order even as it celebrated their achievement in being invited at all. The fireplace, large enough to burn 12-foot logs, cast dancing shadows on walls hung with flags and antlers, creating an atmosphere that was part castle, part hunting lodge, part temple to American industrial might. The organ's pipes filled the vaulted space with music that echoed off stone walls, adding to the sense of ceremonial grandeur that George cultivated for his guests. Music was carefully chosen for each occasion, from sacred works that evoked cathedral traditions to lighter pieces suitable for entertainment. The organist would play before dinner and sometimes during the meal itself, the music providing a soundtrack that enhanced the theatrical quality of dining in the great hall. Guests were not merely eating, they were participating in a ritual that connected them to centuries of aristocratic tradition. George Vanderbilt cultivated an image of himself as an enlightened landlord and modern patron of both arts and sciences. The role was not merely affectation. He genuinely believed in the possibility of improving both land and people through careful management and scientific method. His reading ranged widely across agriculture, forestry, economics, and social reform. He corresponded with experts in multiple fields, seeking advice on how best to develop the estate's resources. The image he projected was that of a gentleman scientist, applying rational principles to the practical problems of managing a large agricultural enterprise. The Biltmore Forest School, established in 1898 under the direction of Carl Schenck and building on earlier work by Gifford Pinchot, became the first forestry school in America. Schenck was a German's forester, whom George had recruited specifically for this purpose, a man trained in the rigorous scientific forestry that German universities had developed over the previous century. Here, young men learned the principles of scientific woodland management, of selective harvesting and replanting, of treating forests as renewable resources rather than mines to be exhausted and abandoned. The school operated on estate grounds, its students learning through direct application of the principles they studied in classrooms. They surveyed timber stands, calculated growth rates, planned harvesting schedules, and supervised replanting operations. The practical education they received was unlike anything available elsewhere in America, where forestry as a profession scarcely existed. Graduates of the Biltmore Forest School would go on to staff the newly created United States Forest Service, to teach at the forestry schools that sprang up at universities across the country, and to manage forests on public and private lands throughout the nation. Gifford Pinchot had come to Biltmore in 1892, fresh from forestry studies in Europe, eager to apply scientific principles to American woodlands. He developed the first comprehensive forest management plan in the country, demonstrating that careful logging could actually improve forest health and productivity over time. His methods would later influence national forest policy when he became the first chief of the United States Forest Service under Theodore Roosevelt. The connection between Biltmore's private experiment and public policy was direct and consequential. What George Vanderbilt funded as a wealthy man's hobby became the foundation for conservation practices that would protect millions of acres. The model dairy produced milk and butter for the estate and for sale in Asheville. Improved breeding programs developed herds that would influence dairy farming throughout the Southeast. The dairy operation employed the latest sanitary techniques, with tiled walls and concrete floors that could be easily cleaned, with strict protocols for handling milk to prevent contamination. The butter and cream that the dairy produced were marketed under the Biltmore name, their quality guaranteed by the estate's reputation. Schools and employment through Biltmore Village and Biltmore Industries provided work for local families who had lost their farms to the estate's expansion. Biltmore Industries trained local craftspeople in traditional techniques of weaving and wood carving, creating cottage industries that would survive long after the original Vanderbilt patronage ended. Women learned to produce homespun textiles of quality that commanded premium prices in northern markets. The looms they used and the patterns they wove combined Appalachian tradition with designs that appealed to arts and crafts movement consumers seeking authentic handmade goods. Men carved furniture in styles that blended local tradition with the aesthetic preferences of wealthy buyers. The products carried the Biltmore name and reputation, their sale providing income for families who might otherwise have had few alternatives in the mountain economy. Photographs from this era show hunting parties gathered on the terraces, carriages lined up before the entrance tower, formal dinners in the candlelit dining room. The visual record preserves moments of ease and prosperity, of a way of life that seemed as permanent as the limestone walls themselves. The photographs were carefully composed to present the estate at its best, but they also captured something genuine about the confidence of those years. The people in the images seem untroubled by doubt, secure in their positions and in the permanence of the world they inhabited. In the second-floor living hall, portraits of Richard Morris Hunt and Frederick Law Olmsted hung alongside old masters and contemporary works, acknowledging the creative partnership that had brought Biltmore into being. George moved through these rooms as patron and administrator, overseeing an enterprise that employed hundreds and generated both income and expense on a scale that few private individuals could comprehend. His letters reveal a man constantly balancing ambition with constraint, vision with practicality, the desire to create something lasting with the awareness that even Vanderbilt resources had limits. Yet even as guests marveled and journalists praised, the mathematics of maintenance ground on beneath the polished surfaces. A servant polished the staircase balustrade as guests passed above, a visual metaphor for the invisible class supporting the American royalty narrative that Biltmore's architecture proclaimed. The workers in the forests and farms whose labor underwrote the illusion of effortless luxury rarely appeared in the society photographs or newspaper accounts. They lived in the village or in scattered cabins on the estate's margins, their daily work making possible the grand dinners and elegant gatherings. The economic relationship between the estate and its workers was complex and cannot be reduced to simple exploitation. Biltmore provided employment in a region with few alternatives, paid wages that compared favorably with other options, offered schools and medical care and housing that workers might not otherwise have enjoyed. Many families found the arrangement beneficial, preferring steady wages and decent housing to the precarious independence of subsistence farming. Yet the gap between the lives of owners and workers was vast and inescapable. visible in every contrast between the furnished grandeur of the main house and the modest cottages where servants lived. Yet every footstep up the polished stairs meant another line in the estate's accounts, and those accounts were tilting in a direction that the family could not ignore forever. The cost of maintaining 250 rooms, of heating a structure that consumed coal by the trainload, of paying the staff required to keep such an establishment running, pressed constantly against even the Vanderbilt fortune. The house had been built to display wealth, not to generate it, and the difference between those two purposes would become increasingly apparent as the years passed. Around 1901, George and Edith Vanderbilt deepened their experiment in creating a self-supporting estate. The vision had always included productive agriculture alongside architectural display, an attempt to prove that a great American estate could operate on the European model, generating income from its lands rather than merely consuming capital. Now, the emphasis shifted more explicitly toward making the farms and forests pay their way. The dream was appealing. A house that could maintain itself indefinitely through the productive work of its own lands, independent of the stock market fluctuations and inheritance divisions that had already begun to fragment other Vanderbilt properties. Improved dairy herds produced milk and cream for sale in Asheville, their output carefully measured and tracked to optimize productivity. The dairy operation represented the latest in scientific agriculture, sanitary milking procedures, careful record-keeping of each cow's production, breeding programs designed to improve yields over generations. Jersey cattle were imported from the Channel Islands, their high butterfat content making them ideal for cream and butter production. The herd grew through careful selection, each generation better suited to the estate's purposes than the last. Poultry and hog operations supplemented the dairy, using waste products from one operation to feed another in an early attempt at what would later be called sustainable farming. Kitchen scraps fed the pigs, dairy waste fed the chickens. Manure from all the animals fertilized the fields that grew their feed. The system was designed to minimize waste and maximize efficiency, applying industrial principles to agricultural production. Rental cottages in Biltmore Village provided steady income from tenants who worked on the estate or in the growing town nearby. These operations generated revenue, but they could not match the cost of maintaining a 250-room house with extensive gardens and thousands of acres of managed landscape. Farm reports and forestry accounts from the period show modest income set against large capital expenditures for equipment, seed stock, and improvements. The dairy was profitable in a narrow sense, earning more than it cost to operate, but its earnings could maintain perhaps a few rooms of the main house, not the vast enterprise that surrounded it. The mathematics were inexorable. Agricultural income, even from intensively managed operations, could not support a building that had cost millions to construct and required hundreds of thousands annually to operate. The forests would eventually become productive, but timber management operates on a scale of decades, not years. The trees that Olmsted and his successors had planted were still young, decades away from producing marketable timber. White pines that had been planted as seedlings were now 15 or 20 feet tall, but they would not reach merchantable size for another generation. The scientific forestry that Gifford Pinchot and Carl Schenck had pioneered at Biltmore was designed for the long term, building value that would accrue to future generations rather than providing immediate returns. George understood this. He had accepted from the beginning that the forestry program was an investment in a future he might not live to see. But understanding did not change the fundamental problem of meeting present expenses with future income. The estate needed money now to pay wages and taxes and maintenance costs. The timber would not provide that money for decades. The gap between present needs and future returns created a structural deficit that no amount of management efficiency could close. The 16th Amendment introducing the federal income tax was ratified in 1913, adding new pressure to already strained finances. The initial rates were modest by later standards, 1% on incomes above $3,000, with a surtax reaching 7% on incomes above $500,000. But the rates represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between great wealth and the national government. For the first time since the Civil War, large fortunes would be taxed directly. their accumulated capital subject to annual assessment rather than merely the occasional bite of property taxes. The impact on George Vanderbilt's personal finances is debated by historians, but the direction of change was unmistakable. The era of untaxed accumulation was ending, and the great houses built during that era would have to find new ways to survive. The income that had built Biltmore was itself becoming a target for taxation, reducing the resources available for maintenance and improvement. Each year would see a portion of the estate's earnings diverted to government coffers, money that might otherwise have gone to repair roofs or pay gardeners or maintain the elaborate mechanical systems that kept the house functioning. New taxes combined with rising labor costs and the increasing expense of maintaining an aging house created a financial environment very different from the one in which Biltmore had been conceived. The servants who had been readily available in the 1890s were now finding better opportunities in factories and offices. Immigration restrictions reduced the flow of workers from Europe who had once filled domestic positions in great houses. The entire labor market was shifting, wages rising as alternatives to service expanded. The workers who remained demanded better conditions and higher pay, and the supply of replacements was no longer unlimited. Correspondence from the EBE in early 1910s hints at tightening budgets and scaled-back operations. Some programs were curtailed, some staff positions eliminated. The Biltmore Forest School closed in 1913, its mission completed in some sense, its graduates spreading across the nation to careers in the new profession. But its closure also reflected the need to reduce expenses wherever possible. The grand vision of a completely self-supporting estate was proving more difficult to achieve than George Vanderbilt had hoped when he first imagined his mountain retreat. During the day, sunlight from the glass winter garden roof spilled up the stairwell, catching dust motes dancing around the chandelier. The light seemed timeless, but at night, several bulbs were switched off to save power in lesser-used wings, a barely visible economy that told a different story. The distant lowing of cattle and the scent of silage from the model barns spoke of productive work, but the contrast between the polished parquet in reception rooms and the worn stone in service corridors revealed the two faces of Biltmore, the displayed wealth and the daily work that maintained it. The architecture built to display limitless wealth struggled when that wealth had to answer to taxes, wages, and market swings. The house had been designed for an era when great fortunes seemed invulnerable, when the income from railroads and shipping could finance any extravagance without thought of return. Now, the world was changing in ways that no amount of limestone and carved stone could resist. By the time war clouds gathered over Europe in 1914, Biltmore's greatest threat was not foreign invasion, but simple arithmetic. In 1914, at age 51, George Washington Vanderbilt died unexpectedly after complications from an appendectomy in Washington, D.C. The news traveled back to Asheville like a cold wind through the corridors of Biltmore, silencing the house that had been built as a testament to one man's vision. The operation had seemed routine, a minor procedure that wealthy patients in the nation's capital could expect to survive without difficulty. But infection set in, and the medical science of the era could offer no remedy. Antibiotics did not yet exist. Surgeons could open the body but could not reliably prevent the infections that followed. George died far from the house he had created, in a hospital room rather than the carved chambers he had imagined as his final home. His body was transported back to Asheville, where he was buried on the estate he had assembled from dozens of small farms. The funeral drew mourners from across the country, the prominent and powerful paying their respects to a man who had created something unprecedented in American history. The newspapers carried extensive obituaries, praising George's philanthropy and his contributions to forestry and agriculture. But beneath the eulogies, practical questions pressed for answers. Edith Vanderbilt, suddenly widowed in her early 40s, became sole owner of an estate that had never truly paid for itself. The inheritance was magnificent in one sense, the largest private home in America, a collection of art and books worth millions, thousands of acres of forest and farmland. But it was also a burden of immense proportions, a property that consumed resources as surely as it had since the day of its completion. The dreams of a self-supporting agricultural empire had not been realized, and now the dreamer was gone. Edith faced choices that no one had prepared her to make. Following negotiations that George had begun before his death, Edith completed the sale of approximately 80,000 acres of Pisgah forest land to the United States government. The price was $5 an acre, $400,000 total paid over time, a fraction of what the land might have been worth to private developers, but a reasonable sum for conservation purposes. The transaction had been in process for years, part of George's own vision for the property. He had always intended that the forests he rehabilitated would eventually pass into public hands, preserved for future generations rather than exploited for short-term profit. Edith brought the sale to completion with the decisiveness that would characterize her management of the estate in the years ahead. The money was needed. Sentimentality could not override financial necessity. This vast tract would form the core of Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. The scientific forestry that Gifford Pinchot and Carl Schenck had developed at Biltmore would now be applied to public lands, their methods validated by government adoption. The sale transformed the estate dramatically. Where once 125,000 acres had stretched across the mountains, now the core property shrank to roughly 8,000 acres surrounding the house itself. The scale was still enormous by any ordinary standard, but it was a fraction of what George had assembled. The forestry school was already closed, its graduates scattered across the nation. The grand agricultural experiments would continue on a reduced scale, but the ambition of matching European estate management had been permanently abandoned. Edith moved into a smaller apartment within the former bachelor's wing, closing off large portions of the house to conserve resources. The decision was practical, but also symbolic. The widow did not need and could not staff a palace of 250 rooms. Dust sheets covered furniture in the closed wings, their contents preserved but unused. Staff was reduced, though the basic maintenance burden remained enormous, regardless of how many rooms were actually in use. Letters from this period reveal both Edith's grief and her determination to preserve what she called her husband's life's work and creation. The wording would echo through generations, later appearing in statements by their daughter Cornelia and her descendants. Biltmore was not merely a house to be maintained, but a legacy to be honored. The emotional weight of inheritance mixed with the financial burden, creating a complex responsibility that would pass from generation to generation. Cornelia Vanderbilt, still a teenager when her father died, grew up in a house that felt increasingly like a museum rather than a home. The rooms that had once hosted glittering gatherings now stood empty much of the time. The chandelier still hung in the stairwell, but the light that fell from it illuminated a diminished household, a widow and her daughter moving through spaces designed for armies of servants and crowds of guests. Edith stood at the top of the grand staircase in those years, the chandelier dim behind her, Biltmore now less a stage for parties than a question she had to answer. Keep, shrink, or surrender. Her first solution, the land sale, had bought time but not permanent safety. The real crisis, when it came, would be triggered not by personal tragedy, but by worldwide economic collapse. The years between George's death and the crash of 1929 represented a kind of holding pattern, an extended period of reduced ambition and careful management. Edith maintained what she could, let go what she must, and hoped that circumstances would improve. The Pisgah land sale provided capital that could be invested, its income supplementing the modest revenues from agriculture and forestry. The reduced household consumed less, its expenses more manageable if still substantial. The strategy was one of patient waiting, of hoping that the estate's situation would stabilize rather than continue to deteriorate. But the structural problems remained unsolved. A house of this scale required either tremendous wealth to maintain as a private residence or some alternative use that could generate supporting revenue. The first option was becoming less available as inherited fortunes dispersed across generations and taxation reduced what could be passed along. The second option would require imagination and courage that no one had yet demonstrated. The next decade would bring the crisis that would force a choice. After the First World War, the 1920s brought inflation, shifting tastes, and new forms of wealth that cared little for the architectural monuments of an earlier era. The Gilded Age was receding into memory, its values increasingly questioned by a society that had seen the old European order collapse in the trenches of France. The young men who returned from the war had different attitudes toward inherited privilege, toward the accumulation of wealth, toward the houses that symbolized a vanished world of certainty and order. The flappers and jazz musicians, the bootleggers and speakeasy patrons, found the heavy grandeur of Gilded Age mansions oppressive rather than impressive. Many Vanderbilt townhouses and country houses in New York were demolished or converted as Fifth Avenue mansions yielded to commercial towers and apartment buildings. The economics were straightforward. The land beneath a mansion was worth more than the mansion itself, and the taxes on such properties in prime Manhattan locations made residential use increasingly impractical. Real estate developers offered prices that heirs found difficult to refuse, particularly when the alternative was paying enormous maintenance costs on buildings that no longer fit contemporary lifestyles. The great limestone facades that had proclaimed the power of industrial fortunes fell to the wrecking ball with surprising speed, replaced by structures that could generate income rather than merely display accumulated capital. William K. Vanderbilt's mansion on Fifth Avenue came down in 1926, its contents dispersed at auction, its site cleared for commercial development. The message was clear. Even Vanderbilt wealth could not preserve Vanderbilt houses indefinitely, not when the economic logic pointed so forcefully toward demolition. Even the Newport palaces struggled under the weight of taxes and upkeep. The Breakers and Marble House survived, maintained by the wealthiest branches of the family, but other cottages began to show signs of neglect. Gardens grew wild, paint peeled, roofs developed leaks that were patched rather than properly repaired. The servant class that had made possible the operation of these great houses was dispersing into factories and offices, drawn by wages and opportunities that domestic service could not match. In 1920, local histories described Biltmore as an estate with its financial resources dwindling, echoing the plight of British country houses that faced similar pressures. The comparison was apt. Like the stately homes of England, Biltmore represented a way of life that required not just wealth, but a particular social and economic structure to sustain it. That structure was dissolving on both sides of the Atlantic, undermined by war and taxation and changing attitudes toward inherited privilege. Edith continued to reduce the estate's holdings. In 1921, she sold Biltmore Village, the planned community that George had built to house workers. The village, with its Tudor-style buildings and All Souls Cathedral, passed into other hands, severing another connection between the house and the landscape it was meant to dominate. Other holdings followed as the need for operating capital pressed against the desire to preserve George's vision intact. Newspaper coverage documented the fate of other Vanderbilt mansions, their demolition providing a stark contrast to a still-standing Biltmore. The family's New York properties disappeared one by one. The wrecking ball that spared Biltmore was not discriminating taste, but geographical isolation. There was no market for commercial development on a mountainside in western North Carolina. The chandelier, now appeared in daylight with several bulbs missing or intentionally left unlit. Dust outlined the stair treads where feet had once passed constantly. The wind whistled faintly through closed shutters in little-used rooms. Architecture designed to signal permanence can outlive the economic model that sustained it by only a generation. By the middle of the 1920s, Biltmore's survival increasingly depended on a decision no Vanderbilt had yet seriously considered: letting strangers in. In April of 1924, Cornelia Vanderbilt married John Francis Amherst Cecil, a British diplomat descended from the Marquess of Exeter, at Biltmore House. The wedding was the last great social event in the house's history, as a purely private residence, drawing guests from across the nation and the Atlantic. The ceremony took place in the spaces where her parents had entertained nobility and industrialists, but the world that had made such gatherings routine was already fading into memory. By the late 1920s, Cornelia and John were effectively the estate's resident stewards, managing day-to-day operations while Edith spent increasing time away. The young couple faced challenges that George Vanderbilt could scarcely have imagined. The economic boom of the 20s brought prosperity to some sectors, but left rural areas largely untouched. The estate's agricultural operations continued to generate modest income, insufficient to cover the costs of maintaining the house. The stock market crash of October 1929 devastated Asheville's economy along with the rest of the nation. Local banks failed, businesses closed, and families who had prospered found themselves struggling. The tourism that had brought visitors to the mountain resort town dried up overnight. Hotels closed, shops shuttered, and prosperity evaporated. Biltmore, dependent on the broader economy, could not escape the general catastrophe. Property tax bills came due regardless of market conditions, and maintenance costs did not decrease simply because the nation was in depression. The Asheville Chamber of Commerce approached the Cecils with a proposal that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. Would they consider opening Biltmore House to the public? A house of such magnificence could attract tourists even in hard times, and those tourists would spend money in local hotels, restaurants, and shops. The estate would benefit from admission fees, and the town would benefit from visitors. It was a bargain born of mutual desperation, a recognition that the old way of doing things was no longer sustainable. Cornelia and John agreed. On March 15, 1930, Biltmore House began receiving paying visitors for the first time. Adults paid $2, children paid $1. The fees were substantial by Depression-era standards, but the house offered something no movie or meal could match, a glimpse into a vanished world of privilege and splendor, an escape from grim economic reality into spaces that seemed to belong to a different order of existence. The house that had been built as the ultimate private retreat became a public attraction. Crowds gathered on the esplanade, not as invited guests, but as customers purchasing access to a world they could never otherwise have seen. They came from Asheville and farther away, curious to see what a Vanderbilt house looked like inside. Cornelia's statement captured the mixture of pragmatism and sentimentality. Mr. Cecil and I hope that through opening Biltmore House to the public, Asheville and Western North Carolina will derive all the benefit they deserve. We both feel in doing this, it is a fitting memorial to my father. After all, it was his life's work and creation. The chandelier now appeared in a radically new context. Visitors craned their necks beneath it, while guides explained its weight and engineering. The light that had once illuminated private gatherings now fell on strangers who had paid for the privilege of standing where Vanderbilt's had stood. Biltmore was no longer a private palace, but a hybrid creation, part museum and part home, open to whoever could afford the price of admission. Opening the house was framed as an act of both desperation and generosity, a way to turn a financial liability into an economic engine for a struggling region. The Depression had stripped away the pretense that great wealth could insulate itself from broader economic forces, but admission fees could not fix everything. Within a few years, even as tourists marveled upward at the chandelier, the family itself began to drift away. Throughout the early 1930s, Biltmore operated as a hybrid institution, part museum and part home. Public routes were carefully mapped out through the principal rooms on the main floor and into the winter garden, banquet hall, and library, while private apartments were secluded behind locked doors in other wings. The logistics of managing a house that was simultaneously a tourist attraction and a residence required constant negotiation between the demands of visitors and the needs of the family. Guides led groups through spaces that still contained personal belongings, explaining the history while avoiding too much intrusion into the present. The transformation from private home to public attraction required planning and compromise. Certain rooms were deemed suitable for visitors, others remained off limits. The tour route was designed to show the most impressive spaces while protecting the family's privacy and limiting wear on the most delicate furnishings. Velvet ropes appeared across doorways, directing foot traffic along approved paths. Signs explained what visitors were seeing, providing context that guests in earlier years would have absorbed from conversation with their hosts. Visitor revenue helped stabilize the estate's finances, but it did not transform Biltmore into a robust business. Overnight, the admission fees of $2 per adult could cover routine operating costs, but not the major capital improvements that an aging building required. Deferred maintenance accumulated in areas hidden from public view. Roof repairs were postponed when possible, mechanical systems patched rather than replaced. The infrastructure that had seemed so modern in 1895 was now 4 decades old, approaching the end of its useful life and requiring either replacement or constant repair. Parts of the house remained unfinished even after 4 decades, including the music room, which still had bare brick walls where paneling had been planned but never installed. The grand visions of George Vanderbilt's original conception remained partially unrealized, frozen in a state of ambitious incompleteness. The music room's bare walls were not a sign of recent economy, but a reminder that even at the height of Vanderbilt wealth, the house had not been entirely finished. The plan had called for elaborate paneling and a ceiling treatment that was never executed. Now, with the house operating as a museum, there was neither the money nor the motive to complete what the original owner had left undone. Early guide scripts from this period outlined what visitors would see on their tour: the vast entrance hall with its limestone arches, the library with its ceiling painting by Pellegrini, the banquet hall with its organ and tapestries. The guides memorized facts about construction costs and room dimensions, about the chandelier's weight and the house's technological innovations. They learned to present information in digestible portions, answering questions without overwhelming visitors with detail. They became interpreters of a vanished world, translating Gilded Age magnificence for Depression-era audiences. The guides learned to answer questions about the family with discretion, acknowledging the Vanderbilt legacy without intruding on the privacy of those who still called Biltmore home. The balance between reverence and accessibility defined the early museum experience. Visitors wanted to feel they were seeing something authentic, not a sanitized display, but they also understood that some matters were private. The guides navigated these expectations with tact, sharing stories that illuminated the past without betraying confidences about the present. Photographs from the 1930s show visitor groups posing on the terraces and in the Winter Garden, their Depression-era clothing a stark contrast to the Gilded Age interiors surrounding them. Women in cotton dresses and men in shirt sleeves stood where society had gathered in evening gowns and formal suits. The democratization of access was evident in every image. These were not the wealthy visitors of the house's first decades, but ordinary Americans who had saved their dollars for an extraordinary experience. Visibleware appeared on stone steps and courtyard pavers, the accumulated effect of thousands of footsteps where only dozens had walked before. The polished surfaces that had gleamed for guests in evening dress now showed the scuff marks of everyday shoes. The carpets that had been designed for occasional use now endured daily traffic. The house was surviving, but the price of survival was erosion, both physical and spiritual. Each tour that passed through the Grand Hall carried away a microscopic layer of limestone, a toll that would compound across generations. In 1934, Cornelia and John Cecil divorced after 10 years of marriage. Cornelia left Biltmore and never returned to live there, spending her remaining years in England and France, far from the house where she had been born. The reasons for the divorce were personal and remained largely private, but its effect on the estate was profound. The daughter of George Vanderbilt, the heir for whom the house had been preserved, chose to leave it behind. She had 2 sons, George and William, who would eventually inherit the property, but she herself had no desire to remain. The symbolic break was as significant as the practical one. The family that had built Biltmore was dispersing, drawn away by other lives in other places. Cornelia had never known the house in its heyday. She had grown up in the diminished establishment that Edith maintained after George's death. Perhaps the house held too many memories of loss, or perhaps she simply preferred life elsewhere. Whatever her reasons, her departure meant that Biltmore would henceforth be managed rather than inhabited by its owners. John Cecil remained in the bachelor's wing until his death in 1954, acting as a kind of resident curator while the house continued to operate as a tourist attraction. He oversaw daily management, negotiated with local officials, and maintained what continuity he could in a situation that had no real precedent. A divorced British diplomat living in his former father-in-law's American castle, supervising tours and reviewing account books, was not a role anyone had anticipated when Biltmore was conceived. Yet it was precisely this willingness to improvise, to adapt to circumstances rather than surrender to them, that kept the house standing. The sound of tour groups entering the stair hall replaced the murmur of house parties. The creak of aging treads under unfamiliar feet, the guide's voice explaining the chandelier's engineering, became the new rhythm of life at Biltmore. As more people saw the inside of the house, fewer members of the Vanderbilt family chose to live there. The building had survived the crisis that threatened to destroy it, but the way of life it had been built to shelter was gone forever. The architecture remained, the social world that had given it meaning had evaporated. Then, for 4 years during the coming war, the chandelier's light would fall not on tourists at all, but on crates of masterpieces stacked in the darkness. Biltmore would find yet another role to play, one that no one could have anticipated when the first visitors arrived in 1930. During the Second World War, from 1942 to 1944, Biltmore House closed its doors to the public for the first time since the opening of 1930. The reason was not financial difficulty, but national security. At the request of David Finley, director of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, the estate became a secret repository for some of the nation's most treasured artworks. 62 paintings and 17 sculptures, including Gilbert Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington and works by Rembrandt and Raphael, were shipped by train from the capital to the mountains of North Carolina. The fear in Washington was real and well-founded. German submarines had been spotted off the Atlantic coast, sinking merchant vessels within sight of the shoreline. In the first months of 1942, the U-boat campaign was so successful that ships were being torpedoed faster than American shipyards could replace them. The possibility of air raids or sabotage could not be discounted, particularly in the uncertain months after Pearl Harbor when the war's outcome remained very much in doubt. Washington itself seemed vulnerable. The capital's location on the Potomac River, accessible from Chesapeake Bay, made it theoretically possible for German forces to strike at the heart of American government. The National Gallery's collection represented an irreplaceable national treasure, assembled over decades through purchases and donations from wealthy patrons, including Andrew Mellon, Samuel Kress, and Joseph Widener. These men had accumulated masterpieces from European collections, often acquiring works that impoverished aristocrats and war-stressed governments were forced to sell. The collection that resulted was one of the finest in the world, a cultural patrimony that the United States had only recently begun to build. Finding a secure location far from major cities and military targets became an urgent priority. David Finley had known George Vanderbilt socially and was familiar with the estate's remote location and substantial construction. The limestone walls and steel framing that Hunt had specified offered protection against fire and conventional weapons. The location in the mountains, far from any strategic targets, made enemy attack unlikely. The climate was suitable for art conservation, with relatively stable temperatures and humidity. Most importantly, the estate was still privately owned and could be secured without the bureaucratic complications that might have attended arrangements with public institutions. The masterpieces were stored in the unfinished music room and other secure spaces within the house, their crates stacked in rooms where carved limestone and bare brick walls protected them from potential harm. The music room's lack of finish, which had seemed a mark of incompleteness for decades, now proved an advantage. There was nothing on the walls that could be damaged by the presence of the crates, no decorative surfaces that needed protection from the handling required to move priceless artworks in and out. The room that George Vanderbilt had never completed became the most important space in the house. Biltmore became a guarded repository, its limestone walls fulfilling a function closer to fortress than family home. Blinds were drawn throughout the house, preventing any observation of the interior from outside. Guards were posted at entrances and along the perimeter, their presence both protection and deterrent. Minimal staff remained on site, sworn to secrecy about what the sealed rooms contained. The transformation was complete. The house that had been designed to impress visitors now sought to escape notice entirely. The few who knew understood the stakes. If word leaked about the location of the National Gallery's treasures, the estate might become a target for precisely the attacks it was meant to prevent. German intelligence services were active in the United States, and saboteurs had already been landed by submarine on American beaches. The secrecy was maintained throughout the war years, with even local residents unaware of what the shuttered mansion contained. The correspondence between David Finley and the Vanderbilt family reveals a negotiation conducted with the urgency of wartime. The gallery director sought protection for priceless art. The estate offered the security of isolation and stone. The terms were agreed quickly. There was no time for prolonged discussion when the nation's cultural heritage hung in the balance. The family's willingness to receive the collection reflected both patriotism and perhaps also a recognition that Biltmore had found a purpose that transcended its original conception. National Gallery records and photographs from this period document the careful handling of crated artworks within Biltmore's interiors. Each painting was wrapped in protective materials, its surface shielded from dust and moisture and physical contact. Each sculpture was cushioned against damage during transport and storage. Climate conditions were monitored and recorded, with adjustments made to heating and ventilation as needed. The mountain house's relatively stable temperatures proved suitable for conservation purposes, the cool summers and mild winters avoiding the extremes that could damage paint and canvas. The chandelier hung in near darkness during these years, its bulbs switched off to save power and to avoid attracting attention. Only a single work light burned nearby as crates passed beneath on their way to storage. The visitors who had craned their necks to admire the fixture's engineering were gone, replaced by soldiers and art handlers moving in organized silence through halls that echoed with their careful footsteps. The transformation was complete. From private palace to public museum to secret vault, the house had assumed yet another identity in its strange evolution through American history. A house built to glorify one fortune had become, briefly but significantly, a shelter for collective cultural memory. The Stuart portrait of Washington, painted from life in 1796, rested behind Biltmore's limestone walls. Rembrandt's self-portrait from 1659, one of the artist's most penetrating examinations of his own mortality, lay crated in darkness. Works by Raphael and Titian and Vermeer, paintings that represented the highest achievements of Western art, were preserved in rooms that George Vanderbilt had designed for his own collection. The mansion that had symbolized private excess now served the public interest in the most direct way possible, protecting treasures that belonged to the nation as a whole. It was a different kind of legacy than George Vanderbilt had imagined, driven by war rather than wealth, by crisis rather than ambition. The conservation mission was temporary but transformative, suggesting possibilities for the house's future role that would inform decisions in the decades ahead. When peace returned in 1945 and the paintings went home to Washington, the crates traveling back along the same rail lines that had brought them, Biltmore faced a familiar question with renewed urgency. What should a private castle become in a democratic century? The war had temporarily solved the problem of the house's purpose, giving it a mission that justified its continued existence and perhaps even elevated its meaning. But with the masterpieces gone and the guards withdrawn, the question returned with all its original force. How could a building of such scale and pretension find a place in a nation that increasingly questioned the values it represented? The post-war world would be different from the one that had built Biltmore, different even from the one that had opened it to visitors in 1930. New solutions would have to be found if the house was to survive another generation. After John Cecil's death in 1954, Biltmore ceased entirely to function as a primary family residence. The house that had been built for one man's comfort became fully an institution, managed by professionals rather than inhabited by heirs. The transformation that had begun with the public opening in 1930 was now complete. No member of the family would ever again live in Biltmore as George and Edith had lived, as masters of a domestic establishment with servants and guests and the daily rhythms of household life. The building had become pure heritage, maintained for visitors rather than owners. The question of who would manage this heritage fell to Cornelia's sons, who had to decide whether to maintain their inheritance or surrender it. Neither lived at Biltmore, neither had the personal connection to the house that their grandfather had possessed. The pure property was a burden as much as an asset, requiring constant attention and substantial resources merely to prevent deterioration. Many families in similar situations had donated their houses to government agencies or nonprofit organizations, trading the burden of ownership for the satisfaction of seeing their properties preserved for public benefit. In 1960, the brothers divided the property in a decision that would shape Biltmore's future for decades to come. George Cecil inherited the more profitable dairy and farmland operations, which would eventually separate entirely from the house. The agricultural enterprise that George Vanderbilt had built could stand on its own as a business, generating income from the sale of dairy products and the management of productive land. William A.V. Cecil inherited the house itself and the surrounding core estate, taking on the responsibility of maintaining a building that consumed resources as surely as it had since the day of its completion. The division recognized a practical reality. The agricultural operations might be profitable, but the house was a liability that only dedication and creativity could transform. William could have sold the property or donated it, relieving himself of the burden. Instead, he committed himself to a vision that would have seemed paradoxical to his grandfather. He would operate Biltmore not as a charitable trust or a nonprofit museum, but as a privately owned, profitable, working estate. The mission statement that eventually emerged from his leadership emphasized sustainability and self-sufficiency, echoing George Vanderbilt's original dreams while adapting them radically to changed circumstances. The house would pay for its own preservation through tourism, hospitality, and agricultural products. It would neither depend on government subsidy nor sacrifice private ownership to achieve financial stability. The goal was ambitious, perhaps quixotic, to make the most expensive private home in American history generate enough revenue to maintain itself indefinitely. No one had accomplished such a thing before, not with a property of this scale and complexity. The great houses of England had mostly surrendered to the National Trust, their owners retaining apartments within buildings they no longer controlled. American mansions had been demolished or converted to institutional uses, their residential characters sacrificed to economic necessity. The idea that Biltmore could actually pay its own way seemed to many observers more dream than business plan. In 1963, the estate was designated a National Historic Landmark, securing official recognition of its architectural and historical significance. The nomination files described the house's Beaux-Arts design in exhaustive detail, documenting the technological innovations and artistic achievements that made it exceptional. The designation acknowledged Biltmore's place in American architectural history, confirming what observers had recognized since the house's completion. This was a building of unique importance, worthy of the nation's attention and protection. The designation brought prestige, but no federal subsidy. Unlike national parks or monuments, national historic landmarks remain in private ownership, subject to the same economic pressures as any other property. Biltmore would still have to pay property taxes, still have to fund its own preservation, still have to find ways to generate revenue from a building that had been designed to consume wealth rather than create it. The landmark status was recognition, not rescue. Marketing brochures from the 1960s repositioned Biltmore for a new era of American tourism. The emphasis shifted from Gilded Age grandeur to family-friendly destination, from exclusive luxury to accessible heritage. The language spoke of education and entertainment, of experiencing history rather than merely viewing it. The target audience was no longer wealthy travelers who might compare Biltmore to the Chateau of France, but middle-class families on vacation, looking for something memorable to do with their children. Middle-class visitors driving on the new interstate highways could now reach Asheville in hours rather than days. Interstate 40, completed through the region in the 1960s, connected the mountains of North Carolina to the growing cities of the Southeast and beyond. Families who might never have considered the long rail journey of earlier decades could now arrive by car, their children eager for adventure, their parents willing to pay for experiences that combined education with entertainment. Biltmore offered them a glimpse of a vanished world that seemed both exotic and safely historical. The robber barons were dead, their excesses safely in the past, and their houses could be toured with curiosity rather than class resentment. The guides presented the story as heritage, as history, as part of the American experience that belonged to everyone who cared to visit. The transformation from private palace to public resource was framed as democratic, as opening to all what had once been reserved for a few. Restoration footage from these years shows workers on scaffolding around the grand staircase, cleaning stonework and rewiring the chandelier. The same fixture that had once symbolized reckless consumption was now treated as fragile heritage, carefully maintained and lit with modern equipment that reproduced the glow of the original electric bulbs. Conservators documented the condition of every surface, creating baseline records against which future deterioration could be measured. The science of preservation had advanced dramatically since 1930, and Biltmore became a laboratory for techniques that would be applied to historic houses across the nation. Paint analysis revealed original colors beneath layers of later repainting. Structural surveys identified problems before they became crises. Climate control systems were upgraded to protect furnishings and finishes from the fluctuations that had damaged them in earlier years. The house was being preserved more carefully and more scientifically than ever before in its history. The crisis of near bankruptcy had resolved not in sale or demolition, as with so many Gilded Age mansions, but in a fundamental shift of meaning. Biltmore passed from private display to public education and entertainment, from the monument of one family's wealth to a business serving thousands of paying customers annually. The house survived because its owners found a way to make survival economically viable, to transform a liability into an asset without surrendering control to government or nonprofit organizations. The contrast with other Vanderbilt properties was stark and instructive. In New York, the family's Fifth Avenue mansions had fallen one by one to the wrecking ball, their sites too valuable for continued residential use. In Newport, properties had been donated to preservation societies or open to tourists under nonprofit management, their owners unable or unwilling to bear the costs alone. The Breakers and Marble House survived as museums, but their survival depended on donations and grants rather than earned revenue. Biltmore alone among the major Vanderbilt houses attempted to survive through commercial operation while remaining in family hands. The decision reflected both principle and personality. William Cecil believed that private ownership provided the best guarantee of careful stewardship, that government agencies and nonprofit organizations brought bureaucratic constraints that could stifle effective management. He also believed that the discipline of the market, the need to satisfy paying customers, would drive improvements that subsidized institutions might neglect. Whether these beliefs were justified, the results would eventually demonstrate. The competition for tourists was intensifying throughout the American South. Other historic properties were opening their doors and improving their facilities, offering alternatives to visitors who might once have had no choice but Biltmore. Colonial Williamsburg had pioneered the immersive historical experience. Mount Vernon and Monticello drew visitors interested in the Founding Fathers. Plantation houses throughout the South offered their own complicated histories to tourists seeking to understand the region's past. Biltmore would have to distinguish itself not just through historical significance, but through the quality of the visitor experience it provided. Yet, to keep the house alive, Biltmore would have to become more than a museum displaying artifacts of a vanished era. It would have to operate as a modern business, constantly adapting to changing tourist expectations while maintaining the historical integrity that gave it value. The shadow of its own past fell across every decision. How to balance preservation with profitability, how to honor George Vanderbilt's vision while meeting the demands of contemporary visitors. The next decades would test whether that balance could be sustained, whether the ambitious mission could actually be achieved. From the 1970s onward, William Cecil and later his son transformed Biltmore into a diversified enterprise that George Vanderbilt might have recognized in its agricultural ambitions, if not in its commercial execution. The estate that had always aspired to self-sufficiency finally achieved it, though through means its founder could never have imagined. The transformation required reimagining what Biltmore could be, moving beyond the museum model that had sustained it through the Depression and war years towards something more dynamic and more profitable. In 1979, a restaurant opened in what had been service areas of the house, serving visitors who now spent entire days rather than mere hours on the property. The Stable Café, located in the former carriage house and stable complex, offered meals in spaces that had once sheltered horses and carriages. The adaptive reuse preserved historic fabric while generating revenue from visitors who needed food and rest during their explorations. The success of this first restaurant demonstrated that hospitality could complement heritage, that serving meals need not compromise the dignity of the historic property. Additional restaurants followed in 1987 and 1995, each expanding the estate's hospitality offerings while finding new uses for historic structures that might otherwise have deteriorated from neglect. The Deer Park restaurant opened in a renovated farm building, offering more formal dining with views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The bistro provided casual options for visitors seeking quick meals. Each venue served different needs and different price points, creating a dining ecosystem that could accommodate the range of visitors who now arrived at the estate. The restaurant operations required professional management and significant investment. Kitchens had to be equipped to modern standards, service staff had to be trained, menus had to be developed that would satisfy visitors while remaining economically viable. The transition from amateur preservation to professional hospitality was gradual but essential. Each successful venture created resources that could be reinvested in preservation, establishing a virtuous cycle that George Vanderbilt had hoped his farms and forests would provide. In 1985, the old dairy barn was converted into a winery, its cows replaced by French-American hybrid grapes grown on the estate's remaining agricultural land. The transformation seemed improbable. What connection could there be between a railroad fortune and winemaking, between a French Renaissance chateau and viticulture? Yet the logic was sound. The estate had land suitable for grape growing. The ideal climate, while not identical to France's wine regions, could support certain grape varieties. Most importantly, visitors who came for the house might also buy wine, creating synergies between heritage and agriculture that earlier enterprises had failed to achieve. The Biltmore winery became one of the most visited wineries in America, its bottles sold to tourists who had just walked through rooms filled with Gilded Age splendor. The combination that had seemed improbable proved irresistible. Visitors could tour the chateau, admire the gardens, sample wines produced on the estate, and carry home bottles as souvenirs of their experience. The wine quality improved over the years as viticulturists learned which varieties thrived in the mountain climate, and winemakers refined their techniques. George Vanderbilt's dream of productive agriculture supporting the estate had finally come true, though the product was fermented grapes rather than timber or dairy. The irony was inescapable. The forests that George had planted for timber production never generated the income he had hoped for, while the winery that no one had imagined produced profits that actually supported preservation. The estate had found its sustainable model not through the scientific forestry that had been its founding vision, but through tourism and hospitality that George might have found vulgar. The hospitality expansion continued into the 21st century with investments that transformed Biltmore from a day trip destination into a resort where visitors might stay for multiple days. The Inn on Biltmore Estate opened in 2001, offering luxury accommodations within view of the chateau. The hotel was designed in a style compatible with the historic property, its architecture complementing rather than competing with Hunt's original design. Guests could wake to views of the house and grounds, spend their days exploring the estate, and return to comfortable rooms without leaving the property. The Village Hotel followed in 2015, providing more affordable options for visitors who wanted to extend their stays but could not afford luxury rates. The hotel occupied a site near the former Biltmore Village, providing accommodations that acknowledged the estate's history while serving contemporary needs. The range of options meant that visitors of different budgets could all find suitable lodging, expanding the potential market for extended visits. Conference and event facilities attracted corporate clients who booked the estate for meetings and retreats. Weddings became a significant business, couples drawn by the romance of exchanging vows in the shadow of a chateau. These events generated revenue while introducing the estate to visitors who might return as tourists. The calendar filled with private functions that helped stabilize income throughout the year, reducing dependence on the seasonal patterns that had long characterized tourism in the mountains. Visitor numbers exceeded 1 million per year, making Biltmore one of the most visited historic houses in America. The figure represented a transformation almost unimaginable to those who had opened the house in 1930, when a few thousand visitors seemed a significant achievement. The growth reflected both effective marketing and genuine appeal. The house had something that visitors wanted to see, and the estate had learned how to welcome them effectively. The assessment of the property for tax purposes reportedly exceeded $150 million, though agricultural deferments lowered the actual taxable value. The agricultural operations that had never quite supported the house now provided tax benefits that helped make preservation economically viable. The cattle that grazed on estate pastures, the grapes that grew in the vineyards, the hay that was harvested from the meadows, all contributed to a land use classification that reduced the property's tax burden. George Vanderbilt's agricultural vision, though transformed in its particulars, still served the estate's financial interests. Aside from brief difficulties during the Great Recession of 2008, the Biltmore Company reported consistent profits since the mid-1990s. The financial goal that had seemed impossible when William Cecil inherited the house had been achieved. Biltmore paid its own way, generating enough revenue from tourism and hospitality to fund its ongoing preservation without subsidy or donation. The estate that had nearly bankrupted its creators now operated as a successful business, employing hundreds of workers and contributing millions to the regional economy. Corporate mission statements and preservation reports from this era emphasized sustainable profitability and conservation in equal measure. The language reflected a philosophy that had evolved over decades. Preservation was not opposed to profit, but dependent on it. The house would survive only if it could generate the resources necessary for its own maintenance. This was not the nonprofit model that governed most historic properties, with their dependence on donations and grants and government support. This was capitalism applied to heritage, the market, as mechanism for cultural preservation. Case studies documented brick-by-brick restoration of the stable courtyard and other features, literal saving of the estate one element at a time. The work was expensive and painstaking, requiring craftsmen with skills that were increasingly rare in modern construction. Limestone carvers learned to match the work of their predecessors from a century earlier. Slate roofers applied techniques that had changed little since the house was built. Conservators stabilized original finishes rather than replacing them, preserving as much authentic material as possible. The preservation work was genuine and substantial, funded by the revenues that tourism and hospitality generated. Roofs were reshingled with appropriate materials. The Vermont slate replaced in kind when age and weather made replacement necessary. Stonework was cleaned and repaired, the Indiana limestone restored to something approaching its original appearance. Mechanical systems were upgraded while maintaining historical appearance, modern climate control hidden behind period finishes. The house of 1995 was in many ways better maintained than the house of 1895, its preservation ensured by the revenue that preservation made possible. Modern holiday footage shows the chandelier reflecting thousands of Christmas lights, the seasonal decorations drawing visitors from across the Southeast for an experience that combines historical education with festive entertainment. The Christmas celebration became one of the estate's signature events, a period of intense visitation that generated significant revenue while creating memories that visitors associated with the property. Marketing videos explained the chandelier's weight and engineering to online audiences, numbering in the millions, spreading awareness of the house far beyond those who would ever visit in person. The soundtrack of tour audio guides replaced the chime of servants' bells that had once coordinated household activities. Visitors moved through the house at their own pace, listening to recorded narration that explained what they were seeing. The guides who had once led groups in person still worked at the estate, but their role had changed. They now answered questions and provided assistance rather than delivering scripted presentations. The technology had transformed the visitor experience while freeing human staff for more personalized interactions. The clink of wine glasses in the former dairy replaced the lowing of cattle that had characterized earlier agricultural operations. The subdued hum of climate control systems replaced the roar of coal furnaces that had consumed those legendary 25 tons in 2 weeks. The house still functioned as a machine, but the machinery had changed entirely, updated to contemporary standards while preserving the appearance of the past. The paradox at the heart of Biltmore's survival could not be avoided or resolved, only acknowledged and accepted. To preserve an anti-democratic symbol of concentrated wealth, the estate had to become a mass-market experience, selling tickets and wine and hotel rooms and a carefully curated version of its own difficult past. The house that had been built to exclude the public now depended on the public for its survival. The transformation was complete, yet something of the original remained. The limestone walls, the carved stone, the chandelier hanging from its single bolt. The meaning had changed, but the form endured. Even so, stone is not immune to time, and in recent years, a different kind of threat had reminded Biltmore how fragile even America's largest home could be. The climate that had once seemed benign was changing, bringing new challenges that preservation science was only beginning to understand. In the early 21st century, Biltmore confronted challenges that neither George Vanderbilt nor his descendants could have anticipated. Climate stress brought more intense storms to the mountains of western North Carolina, weather events that exceeded the historical patterns on which the estate's infrastructure had been designed. Severe weather tested the estate's buildings and grounds in ways that routine maintenance could not address. The accumulated footfall of millions of visitors wore its stone and wood surfaces despite the best preservation efforts. The question of how long any building can last, no matter how solidly constructed, pressed against the optimistic narratives of permanent preservation. The challenges were not merely physical, but also philosophical. What did it mean to preserve a monument to Gilded Age wealth in an era of growing income inequality and renewed debate about the concentration of economic power? Some critics argued that celebrating Biltmore meant celebrating the system that had produced it, the unequal distribution of resources that allowed one family to command such extravagance, while others struggled for basic necessities. Defenders responded that the house was now public heritage, that its preservation served educational purposes that transcended its origins, that understanding history required preserving its artifacts, even when those artifacts represented values we might question. The debate played out in academic journals and newspaper opinion pages, in visitor comments and online reviews. The estate responded by expanding its interpretive programs, adding context that acknowledged the complexity of the history being presented. The story of Biltmore could not be reduced to simple celebration or simple condemnation. It required nuance and honesty about both achievement and cost. The guides and exhibits evolved to provide that nuance, presenting a more complete picture than earlier generations of visitors had received. The limestone that Hunt had specified for its durability showed the effects of a century of exposure to mountain weather. Acid rain, though reduced from its peak in the 1980s, had etched the stone surfaces, softening carved details and eroding protective patinas. Freeze-thaw cycles worked their slow damage on joints and cracks, water seeping into crevices and expanding as it froze, gradually widening the gaps. The constant humidity fluctuations of mountain weather stressed the stone in ways that continental climates did not, the rapid changes requiring constant adaptation from materials designed for slower transitions. In 2024, Hurricane Helene brought significant flooding and damage to the estate's grounds and infrastructure, temporarily closing the property while repairs were undertaken. The storm had tracked inland from the Gulf Coast, its remnants colliding with the moisture-laden air of the mountains to produce rainfall of historic proportions. Rivers throughout western North Carolina overflowed their banks, washing away roads and bridges, flooding homes and businesses, causing destruction that would take years to repair. The house itself was spared serious harm, its position on higher ground protecting the main structure, even as lower areas of the estate suffered significant damage. The approach roads that Olmsted had designed were washed out in places, their carefully graded surfaces scoured by rushing water. Gardens that had been maintained for over a century were flooded, plants drowned by water that stood for days in low-lying areas. The agricultural operations suffered losses that would take seasons to recover from. News photographs showed floodwater at the entrance roads, a reminder that the natural forces that had shaped the mountains long before the Vanderbilts arrived remained active and unpredictable. The contrast between the dry interiors and the devastated landscape outside captured something essential about Biltmore's position, protected by design, yet not invulnerable to the world beyond its walls. The limestone walls that had sheltered national treasures during wartime could not shelter the estate from climate change. The Biltmore Company pledged millions toward regional recovery, emphasizing its role not just as a private business, but as an anchor institution in the western North Carolina economy. The estate had become the region's largest employer and one of its most significant economic engines, its prosperity intertwined with the prosperity of surrounding communities. The commitment to regional recovery reflected both genuine concern and enlightened self-interest. If the region suffered, the estate would suffer with it. Visitors would not come to a place surrounded by devastation. The language of corporate responsibility echoed distantly the paternalism of George Vanderbilt's original vision, the idea that great wealth carried obligations to the surrounding community. George had built schools and churches and housing for his workers, believing that the prosperity of his estate depended on the well-being of those who worked there. His descendants expressed similar beliefs in different language, speaking of community partnership and regional development rather than noblesse oblige, but the underlying principle remained recognizable. The mission to remain a profitable working estate while safeguarding historic fabric continued to guide decisions, even as the costs of both preservation and community support mounted. Each crisis required new investments that had not been budgeted, new expertise that had to be acquired, new systems that had to be developed. The business model that had worked so well in normal times was tested by events that exceeded normal parameters. The estate's financial reserves, accumulated through decades of profitable operation, were drawn down. To fund recovery, current interpretive panels throughout the estate document environmental initiatives and preservation projects, educating visitors about the ongoing work required to maintain a building of such scale and complexity. The narratives have evolved from simple celebration of Gilded Age grandeur to more nuanced discussions of wealth, labor, and the economics of heritage preservation. Visitors learn not just what the Vanderbilts built, but what it has cost to maintain, both financially and philosophically, across more than a century of American history. The interpretation has become more honest about the social costs of concentrated wealth, acknowledging the workers whose labor made the estate possible and the communities whose land was absorbed into the Vanderbilt holdings. The story told today is different from the story told in 1930 or 1960, more complicated and more complete. The guides and panels do not condemn George Vanderbilt, but neither do they simply celebrate him. They present a history that acknowledges both achievement and cost. Today, visitors stand at the base of the grand staircase in much the same position as George Vanderbilt's guests did in 1895, looking up at the chandelier that has hung there for 130 years. The perspective is identical, neck craning back, eyes following the curves of iron up through the four-story space, trying to comprehend how such weight can hang from such slender support. The sense of wonder has not changed, even if the context has transformed entirely. But they do so with audio guides in hand in a house that is simultaneously business and monument, both survivor and warning. The technology has transformed the visitor experience in ways that would have astonished the first tourists of 1930 who followed human guides through spaces lit by the same electricity George Vanderbilt had installed. The audio guides speak in multiple languages, serving visitors from around the world who have traveled to see what an American railroad fortune built. The international audience would have surprised George, who looked to Europe for inspiration. Now, Europeans come to America to see what America made of European models. The light falls from the same fixture, its glow restored through careful conservation and modern electrical systems. The visitors are not Vanderbilt guests arriving in private rail cars for Christmas celebrations. They are ordinary Americans who have paid for admission, who have driven to Asheville on interstate highways, who have waited in line and followed roped pathways and listened to recorded narration. They come from every state and dozens of countries, drawn by curiosity about wealth and history, about architecture and landscape, about how the other half once lived. The transformation is complete in one sense. The private palace has become a public attraction open to whoever can afford the modest price of entry. Yet, something remains of the original, something that explanations and audio guides cannot entirely capture. The space itself imposes a kind of awe that transcends historical knowledge, a visceral response to scale and beauty that visitors experience whether or not they understand the history. The chandelier still amazes, the banquet hall still impresses, the library still suggests the pleasures of a life devoted to reading and collecting. The camera of memory tilts up one final time, as it did in the prologue, to find the chandelier against the ceiling. The movement mirrors countless visitor photographs, countless tilted heads, countless moments of contemplation over the decades. In 1895, its ironwork was new, its bulbs blazing over a future that seemed limitless. George Vanderbilt had created something that he believed would endure forever, a monument to his taste and his vision that would outlast his physical body and carry his name into future centuries. Now, the iron bears fine restores marks, evidence of careful maintenance across decades. Conservators have documented every component, created records that would allow reconstruction if necessary, treated the fixture as the artifact of national significance that it has become. Modern LEDs reproduce the glow of early bulbs, their light indistinguishable from the original illumination, but far more efficient and far less likely to damage the surrounding materials. The appearance remains constant while the technology transforms. Biltmore did not defeat time or tax law or economic change. It survived by changing its own identity, from private dream to public memory, from statement of individual power to collective heritage attraction. The process of transformation was neither smooth nor inevitable. At each turning point, decisions had to be made that might have gone differently. The land sale after George's death, the opening to the public after the crash, the wartime closure for art storage, the shift to diversified tourism in the post-war decades, all represented choices that preserved the building while altering what it meant. Different choices would have produced different outcomes. The house might have been demolished like so many Vanderbilt properties in New York. It might have been donated to a government agency or nonprofit organization, like the great houses of England that passed to the National Trust. It might have been subdivided or converted to institutional use, like mansions that became schools or museums or corporate headquarters. That Biltmore survived as a privately owned, profitable enterprise was the result of specific decisions by specific people who chose preservation over alternatives that might have been easier or more lucrative. In photographs, Biltmore still looks like a defiance of time, its limestone walls and slate roofs apparently as permanent as the mountains that surround them. The image captures the appearance, but not the effort, the visual. Permanence, but not the constant work required to maintain it. Every surface has been cleaned and repaired multiple times. Every system has been updated and replaced. The building that visitors see today is not the building of 1895, but a careful reconstruction. Original materials maintained where possible, replacements matched where necessary. In truth, Biltmore is a negotiated truce, a daily compromise between the forces that would wear any building away and the economic and cultural systems that justify its continued preservation. Entropy presses against every surface, moisture seeks every crack, time erodes every edge. The preservation staff works constantly against these forces, slowing the inevitable decline, postponing the moment when accumulated damage exceeds the capacity for repair. The battle is never won, only continued. The chandelier still hangs from a single bolt in the roof, as it has since workmen first raised it into position more than a century ago. Engineers have examined the connection, verified its integrity, calculated the stresses, and determined that the original design remains sound. The bolt has been supplemented with safety cables, invisible precautions against the failure that no one expects, but prudence requires preparation for. The weight that visitors marvel at is real. The security that they assume is also real, but it rests on continuous vigilance rather than original construction alone. What holds the chandelier now is not a fortune in the old sense, not the concentrated wealth of a railroad dynasty flowing freely into maintenance and improvement. What holds it now is something more democratic and more precarious, the collective decision of millions of visitors paying their admission fees and buying their wine, choosing to remember what was built here and what it cost. Each ticket purchased contributes to the fund that pays for preservation. Each bottle of wine sold adds to the resources available for maintenance. The chandelier hangs ultimately on the continued willingness of ordinary Americans to support an extraordinary place. The house remains. The light still falls through the winter garden roof at certain hours, illuminating spaces that have witnessed wedding celebrations and wartime secrets, tourist crowds and solitary custodians. The formal gardens bloom in their seasons, maintained by gardeners who have inherited techniques developed over a century. The forests that Olmsted planted have matured, their canopy providing the frame for views that he designed before his mind failed and his work passed to others. The story of Biltmore is not a triumph over impermanence, but an ongoing accommodation with it, a recognition that even the grandest monuments require constant renewal to survive. In the end, what George Vanderbilt built endures not because he succeeded in freezing time, but because those who came after found ways to keep the building useful to generations he never imagined. The purpose has changed, the economics have transformed, the social context has shifted beyond recognition, but the limestone walls still stand, the chandelier still hangs, and the light still falls on visitors who come to see what a railroad fortune built and what it took to keep it standing. The chandelier burns on, powered now by sources its original installer could not have conceived, its light a reminder that permanence is always a work in progress, never a completed achievement. The guests who gathered beneath it in 1895 believed they were witnessing something eternal. They were wrong about the eternity, but right about the witnessing. They saw something remarkable, something worth remembering, something that later generations would choose to preserve. That choice, renewed each year by visitors and managers and conservators, is what keeps the light burning. That choice is what holds the chandelier. The decision is not made once, but continuously. Each admission ticket a vote for preservation. Each bottle of wine purchased a contribution to the fund that maintains these walls and roofs and gardens. The house survives, not because George Vanderbilt built it to last forever, but because millions of people have decided, year after year, that it should last a little longer, that the story it tells is worth continuing, that the light should keep burning in the stairwell where it first blazed on a Christmas Eve more than a century ago. The chandelier hangs, the light falls, the story continues.